So today, we've got a pad of Exiles builds. The Stormcaller Witch Hunter. This is a build that I've come up with and been playing, and I've been blasting tier 15 Waystones. But before I jump into some gear, skill trees, ascendancies and skill gems, I thought we'd go through the strengths and weaknesses and showcase the build a little bit. So I think this build is pretty good at running and blasting through maps. I mostly run rare tier 15 maps and have no problem generally. However, using the Stormcaller arrow means we do have to wait for 1 second before that lightning strikes. And a lot can happen within that 1 second, which generally feels like a lot of fun for me. We're also using the skill Shark Burst Round, which is a crossbow skill, meaning we are going to be weapon swapping, but it's generally fast and we'll only use it on tough rares or bosses. But the downside of Shark Burst Rounds is that we'll have to take out a 15-year mortgage of mana when you have to reload this freaking crossbow. So prepare to press your mana potion after reloads. Mana's not too much of an issue during mapping anyway whatsoever. Then defenses are a bit on the low side, being invasive builds, but we do have some support for it by blinding enemies and maiming them, which means we just slow them down. And we also have our Ascendancy Sorcery Ward, which is basically a 2000 to 3000 elemental barrier. So I say the defenses are on a bit on the low side because you can randomly get one shot from physical damage, especially from some exploding bites. And I was thinking of including some armor later on in the builds, but it might require more investment. The build so far has been good at Breach, Expedition and Delirium, but I've only ran these in tier 15 maps. Not the endgame of these yet, like Simulacrum or Logbooks, so I can't really comment on how performs in these as of right now. As for Ritual, it can be a bit dicey at times, being stuck in some small areas while the ritual's going on. Also, we did get a 4th Ascendancy, we did the Trial of Segments at level 89. It was a bit tough at times, not gonna lie. We had to learn the boss for sure, but still managed to beat it, and I think it is pretty doable with this setup. I haven't really tried the Temple of Chaos yet, so I cannot comment on this really. And finally, Bossing. It is still a pretty decent bossing, as we are currently taking on map boss difficulty 3 in rare tier 15 map. Still being able to take them out within just about a minute, maybe 2. Okay, so now let's go through our gems, our skills. So basically your Stormcaller arrow is gonna only be level 18, but we get plus 3 levels from our global modifiers, which basically means plus 1 to projectiles here and plus 2 projectiles from here, so bring us up to level 21, which is not too bad. But we have fully linked it, and our first support is going to be fast forward. Basically what this does is lessens our skill effect duration, which what it does is it actually decreases that duration that we shoot at our arrow. Meaning that when we shoot out our lightning, it takes a little bit less longer for lightning to call down. As you take it out, it goes up to about 1.5 seconds, so it's definitely worth having in. Well, from my opinion, I think it is. As for our next skill gem, we just have Martial Tempo. All it does is increase how much attacks we do get per second. Pretty self-explanatory and awesome. Then we got Overcharge, which just increases our effective shock. We just want to get as much shock increased on our opponents, because more shocks, the higher shock we do have, the more damage they do take, which is pretty darn smashing. Next up, we got Lightning Fusion, which just gives us a bit more DPS. We gain 25% of our damage as extra lightning damage, but we do a lot less cold and fire damage as well. And then finally, for our last skill, I'm using Innervate as of right now. Now, this is really fantastic just for run through maps, Breach, anything with lots of mob density. Other than that, it's not so great. I'm also considering using Mobility, because this is going to be much better. It just feels more fluid going through maps and stuff like that. It's also pretty darn smashing going up against some bosses as well, because Innervate does literally nothing unless the bosses does spawn a bunch of mobs. I'm also trying out Coursing Current, but I'm not too sure if I want that either. And eventually we could fit in Scattershot, just means we shoot out more arrows. I don't mind it. I don't like the attack speed decrease, to be quite honest. So I'm kind of liking Innervate for right now, especially for blasting through maps. But hey, then our secondary skill is going to be Shark Burst Rounds, which when we do flip to this side, we do have it at level 26, basically from our crossbow here, giving a plus 6 to all projectile skills, while still having plus 2 from our amulet. But we haven't got this fully linked yet, and it's still pretty darn smashing. So basically we're doing about 7,800 damage per bolt, but then once we do pulse, we're doing about 51,000 DPS, and we still have that 75% lightning resistance penetration. But hey, our links are going to be elemental focus, just means we do 25% more elemental damage. Now more is always going to be better, just remember that more is multiplicative and increases additive, so more is more important. And the negative effects, we cannot inflict ailments. Well, all we want to do is inflict shock with our Stormcaller. We don't inflict ailments with the Shock Burst Rounds, but it can't even inflict shock, so yeah, it's just a no-brainer of a skill support. Next up, we got Primal Armaments, which means our supporter skills deal 25% more weapon elemental damage. Now this support is going to really rely on your stats on your crossbow, which we do have lightning and coals. We also have physical, which is not as great, but we do want high physical because we're going to be converting lots of our physical damage to lightning damage as well. But I did prioritize adding in extra lightning damage to make better use of this primal armament. Next up, I'm using Heft for now. It does use up a lot more stamina. I'm kind of leaning towards using skills. They don't use up a whole lot of stamina because a lot of mana, because it does cost us 261 mana, and yeah, we only have about a 547 mana. Yeah, we're going to be doing a 30% more physical damage, which is nice, especially since in our passive tree, we do have this specific skill. Lightning damage with non-critical hits is lucky. And what lucky means is, lucky things are rolled twice and you get the results. They're better used results. So that means, since we're going to get more maximum physical damage, any of that converted into lightning is going to be rolled twice. So I think this is a pretty darn smashing skill for shock burst rounds. And then finally we're using concentrate effect, which means we deal 40% more area damage and 50% less area effects. Basically what this does is, you see our damage per second with pulse, we take that out, it increases our pulse damage by a lot. But it doesn't affect our projectiles whatsoever. Just that pulse, it just adds a lot of DPS. But then as for our final socket, I'm planning to use in our final slot is probably going to be something like ammo conversion. Just reduce our mana cost a little bit. I'm also considering actually using Scatter Shot here. Now Scatter Shot does reduce our damage by quite a bit. Now it did take out the concentrate effect, but it does turn our crossbow into kind of a burst rifle and give us 3 times our amount of both. So we'll have to see how this one goes, but right now, kind of lean towards ammo conversion. And then our final skill that we use is Voltaic Mark. Basically all this does is it gives more chance to shock and it increases that effectiveness on shock and bullets, which is what we use on tough rares or bosses, bringing our shock about from 56% to 81% increased damage taken, which is really, really, really fantastic. What our supports for this is going to be persistence, meaning it does last a lot longer. Then we also got life tap. I do like this because we do have to reload our shock burst rounds and it just eats up a lot of mana. Then we got arcane tempo, just increase the speed of our Voltaic Mark. So basically we just go and the dude is marked. As for auras, I'm using Herald of Thunder, Wind Dancer, and Sorcery Ward. So basically what Sorcery Ward does is it gives us about a 2800 elemental barrier, meaning we can take 2800 of any elemental damage from hits is taken from that buff before it takes from our life, which is pretty darn smashing. Now the supports we have for this is literally going to be Fire Mastery, Cold Mastery, and Lightning Mastery, just increasing that level. I'm also using Precision here, which honestly we probably don't really need. I just like having it in since we do have some spare for now, just making it a little bit easier to deal with some evasive monsters. Next up, we have Wind Dancer, and what Wind Dancer does is it gives us nearly 20% more evasion rating per stage, and we do get 4 stages with this, but it does have to charge every 1.3 seconds. So this is going to give us a boat load of evasion, but if we do get hits, we do lose all of our evasion. So you better run away super fast if you do get hit. But our supports for this is going to be Cannibalism, which means we're going to get 4% of life recovered on kill while the support is active. Magnified effect, honestly this one is not too necessary. This is just for that knockback effect, dealing damages, pushing enemies away from us a bit further. Then we also have Clarity, which I do really like having in because it does mean you get some mana regen. And then finally Herald of Thunder, which is going to be a lot of DPS added to our whole setup as well. So while this is active, killing shocked enemies with attack damage will cause the next subsequent attack. The hits release lightning bolts, which deals attack damage to all surrounding enemies. Lightning bolts strike the targets of your next 3 attacks, while it's up to 5 since we do have the quality up, after killing shocked enemies. So this just adds in a lot more DPS for us, since we're going to be shocking so many enemies. But our supports for this, we're going to be using Lightning Penetration, meaning we're going to have 105% Lightning Penetration, which is kind of awesome. But then our other 2 support gems are going to be Utility. With Blinds, we do have a 100% chance to blind on hit, so our Herald of Thunder is going to be reflecting blind to all the little enemies around. And being blinded causes a 20% less accuracy rating and evasion rating, lasting for 4 seconds, making our evasion a lot better. And then we also got Support Attacks, Maim on hits, and what Maim does is, so what this does is it slows down our opponent by 30% and a 50% reduced evasion rating, making it much easier to continuously hit our opponents by reducing our evasion, and increasing our precision. Yeah, we probably don't need that precision. But hey, that's pretty much our whole skill gem setup. And we do also have Orb of Storms, but I'm not actually using it. We also have Galvanic Shards, which I'm not using. or crossbow shot or bow shot as well. Okay, so let's run it through our gear. Now, I just want to say our gear is very, very average. I think each piece of gear shouldn't cost more than 10, maybe 15 exalted, and some of this stuff could be gotten for about 1 exalted, to be quite honest. But unfortunately, since we're going to be weapon swapping, we are going to need 2 weapons. However, we're going to be using a unique bow that is relatively cheap on the trade website. I'm pretty sure this costs about 1 exalted right now, which is not too bad. Now we're going to be using this because it does shoot 4 additional arrows, which just makes mapping a lot nicer, to be honest. As for mana and life gained as well, it just kind of sustains us, which is nice. Crit damage, going to be pretty much useless, and I did opt to have in some storm runes, or a little bit more lightning damage. But again, this is going to be a super low DPS unique, which we're going to have to scale up our damage in other ways, from our gloves, from our rings, to our quiver as well. So our quiver is going to be where most of our DPS comes from. So our dream stats on this would be elemental damage to attacks being fire, cold, and lightning. I don't mind physical, since we're going to be doing a little bit less cold and fire. Lightning is going to be what we kind of want the most. Then we also got a stat, which is dexterity, which I do really enjoy having. Then +1 to all projectile skills is fantastic as well. And then I would trade in this crit damage for attack speed. And that would be a super awesome quiver for this build. Next up, let's run through our rings, because our rings are going to add lightning damage to attacks and elemental damage to attacks as well. Now this ring kind of sucks because it does have increased fire damage, a low life per killed, but it does have 2 reses, which I do need. Now they're going to be a low tier. I do want to upgrade this as soon as possible, but for right now it's pretty decent for what we're doing. Then next up we got ourselves an amethyst ring, which does have a life stat, lightning damage to attacks. Now it does have increased fire damage, but I would replace this for increased damage to attacks or increased lightning damage. Then we also got intelligence, which is not super great, but it does have a pretty darn smashing lightning res, and it also has some dexterity as well. So our dream stats for rings is going to be lightning damage to attacks, so max life, increased lightning damage, maybe increased physical damage to attacks. Then 1 stat like dexterity strengths, and then 2 reses like lightning res, chaos res, or different elemental res. We'd like that on both our rings. But hey, we are capped on lightning, fire, and cold, but we're not capped on chaos, which is why we're using this charm, so we can be capped if we do get hit by chaos res. But let's go ahead and take a look at our crossbow. Now, our crossbow is pretty decent. It could always be improved. The main reason why we're using this is because it does have +6 to all projectile skills, increased attack speed, and 2 elemental damage to attacks, as well as physical damage to attack. Now, I definitely want to increase the tiers of these. They're pretty low, and increasing these will increase our DPS quite significantly. So the dream stats would just high tiers of these, +6 to all projectiles, increased attack speed, and for right now I do kind of want dexterity. But yeah, I did actually get this for 1 exalted, which is not too bad for this crossbow. It was relatively cheap. Let's run through our armor set right now. We're going to be rocking evasion, mostly base gear, with some armor as well, because I'm thinking about moving into some armor and evasion. But for our gloves, it doesn't provide a whole lot of evasion rating or armor, to be quite honest, but it does give us a lot of lightning damage to attacks, a lot of physical damage to attacks, large amount of max life. Well, it could always be improved. Now, mana per killed is not really super great. Dexterity, which is what we need, as well as some fire res. So they're not too bad gloves here. The only bad thing is it doesn't really provide much defenses in the way of armor or evasion. But everything else it does provide is super smashing. So to be honest, the only thing I'd really change about these gloves is probably removing our mana per kills and getting either another res or another stat if we do need it. Next up we got our belts, which I'm only using a fine belt for now for increased flash charge per second. It's kind of nice in bosses, but we don't really necessarily need it. But it does have a high life stat. Armor is basically useless. Charm effect duration is not really that fantastic, but it does help a little bit since we're not going to be capped on chaos res, but not a whole lot. But the reason we're using this is because the suffixes are pretty good with a lot of fire res, decent bit of lightning res, and our strength as well. Next up we do have our boots. With boots, you definitely need increased movement speed on all boots. Otherwise they're kind of useless because movement speed is key in this game. So the dream stats for boots would be increased movement speed, a large life, increased armor and evasion, 2 stats, and a stat. Or maybe even 3 resistances. But for right now, this is going to be an armor and evasion. It does give us chaos, lightning, and movement speed, and some increased armor and evasion, which is always pretty darn nice. Everything else, the max mana and stun threshold, not so great. Our cap is going to be a lot of evasion rating for us. We did roll a high max life increase. We did get 2 evasion ratings, then cold and fire res, which we do like. Then I would change this intelligence to something like strength or dexterity. And then finally our chest piece. Now our chest piece is pretty much garbage. The only reason why I'm going to be using this is for that cold res and that chaos res, and some increased evasion rating, even though this is super low tier evasion rating. Now this is probably what we're going to upgrade next, but I do kind of want something with lots of max life, cold res and chaos res. And then finally, our amulet. Now our amulet is by far probably the worst piece of gear we do have. We're only going to be using this for that +2 to all projectile skills, a tiny bit of strength, and some increased evasion rating. Intelligence we don't need, increased armor we don't really need right now, and increased cast speed only really kind of affects that skill. So our dream amulet would probably be like a stellar amulet or one that gives strength or dexterity. But we'd want increased evasion rating, increased max life, large max life increase, then possibly 2 stats like dexterity and strength, and then +3 to all projectile skills. But we did also 90 it with the sharpened claw passive. So we open up our passives, we have a quick look at it. It's going to be this skill up here, which just increases our attack damage, and it only requires ire, greed, and greed, which is relatively cheap. To be honest, I got these from probably running like 3 or 4 deliriums, which is not too bad. So yeah, that pretty much covers all our gear. Now we're using this flask, which just gained flash charges per second with increased recovery rate, gain charges per second with increased recovery rate as well. Okay, so let's talk about our passive tree. So this is going to be the whole tree. And early on, I'd recommend grabbing these skill nodes, being Remorsefulness, heading over to Heavy Ammunition, grabbing a Ricochet as well, grabbing some two-handed weapon damage, and kind of making our way down to Instant Reload. I do think this makes the crossbow a lot more fluid and more fun, in my opinion. Then maybe grabbing Feel No Pain and some Battle Hardened for some armor and evasion, just making yourself more tankier. But anyway, we do have 2 different weapon set skills. So before we do talk into these, I do want to talk about our general skill tree. So basically our whole general skill tree is grabbing lots of projectile damage, increased lightning damage, projectile damage, elemental damage, lightning penetration, lightning damage as well, Colin Strike thresholds, attack damage, and a crap ton of evasion wherever we can find it. Being here, over here, lots of evasion. And again, penetrating lightning resistance. But some of the most important skill nodes to note is probably like your Colin Strike thresholds, which this is going to make maps a lot better by taking out a lot of little enemies faster and faster. Lightning Rod, basically making all our lightning damage lucky, which rolls twice, giving us some max results, which is fantastic. It just increases our DPS quite significantly. I also do like this skill, After Image, 8% more chance to evade enemy attacks is also pretty darn nice. Then I also think Catalyst over here is actually smashing because it does give you that 5% of physical damage from hits taken as a damage of random elements. Now I'd love to grab more physical damage hits taken as a random element, but so far this is the only way we're going to get it for right now. Then I also think Heavy Ammunition is pretty good at increasing our projectile stun build-up. And then finally we got Careful Consideration. Now this one is fairly noticeable. It does give you a crap ton of evasion, but if you do get hit, this evasion it does disappear. So yeah, be very careful with Careful Consideration. So moving on to our weapon sets, we're going to start off with our weapon set 1, which is our bow and arrow. So the difference between this skill tree and this skill tree is with a bow and arrow, all we want is a bunch of shocks. So we're going to be taking this node to have a chance to shock enemies within some meters. Increase shock chance. We go over here, we grab this skill tree here, just increasing our magnitude of shocks and also getting shock duration. And finally, we're grabbing these as well, increasing the magnitude of ailments you inflict. 5% increased ailments you inflict. Now the duration of damaging elements we don't use, but we just want to increase our shock like crazy. Now this should also inflict our blind and our maim as well, so kind of do like it, even though it is going to be kind of minimal. So now on our weapon set 2 is going to be our crossbow. Now the only difference with a crossbow is we're just going to be grabbing as much projectile damage. We grab these two-handed weapon damage. We also grab this for a bit of strength. Then we also got the reload crossbow speed because we don't want that on our bow and arrow, just on our crossbow. And we also took this over here, which is increased damage with hits against enemies inflicted by ailments. We only want to use our shock burst rounds when the enemy is shocked. So just increase our DPS overall on our crossbow without having any chance to inflict some shock. But before we do move on, I do have to say we do have some dual sockets as well. Now these are not going to be that great. This one is the best one we have, which just gives you strength, lightning damage, chance to shock, and increased magnitude of ailments you inflict. The poison on hit, pretty garbage. We don't want that. We'd much prefer something else. But in this one, we do have increased attack speed, increased attack damage, accuracy rating, which is garbage, poison duration is garbage, And then finally we do have this one over here, which just increased evasion rate, attack damage, and then poison duration, which is garbage, and flash charges, which is kind of garbage. But yeah, that is gonna cover our skill tree. Not too bad, pretty decent, for sure. So let's talk about Ascendancy. So first of all, we're going to grab damage versus low life enemies, and then grab Pitiless Killer, which does give us Culling Strike. Culling Strike insta-kill enemies while below at 30% HP for normal enemies, 20% for magic enemies, rares at 10% and uniques at 5, which are their bosses. Pretty nice, definitely pretty nice, especially when you combo with the next one, which you did grab more damage versus low life enemies, and also Judge, Jury, and Executioner, which does give us Decimating Strike. Now this gives us hits against full enemies remove between 5% and 30% of life before the damage of hit is applied. Now that is really fantastic and makes mapping feel awesome with this build. That and Culling Strike just cuts out a crazy amount of max HP on little enemies, as well as some bosses too. Then for third Ascendancy, I did prioritize grabbing Armor and Evasion and Sorcery Reward. I do like this quite a lot, but be wary of this skill because you do lose 50% of your evasion rating. We did lose about 10k, 9k of our evasion rating grabbing this for 3000 elemental HP barrier, and I definitely think it is worth it. I do think Sorcery Reward is a fantastic Ascendancy. Now, I don't think we should probably grab this one. I think that this one is just going to be enough defenses on our Ascendancy. So I did prioritize grabbing Increased Area Effect and Zealous Inquisition. This was our fourth Ascendancy, and this has made mapping feel even nicer, as we're going to be shocking enemies to take increased damage, then they're going to be taking 100% of that max life as physical damage. So sometimes you'll come across a rare monster in a pack of normal or magic monsters, and you'll kind of insta-explode that rare super fast. It just makes mapping a hell of a lot more fun, in my opinion. So before we do end this video, I just want to throw in a few disclaimers. I just want to say I'm more of a casual Path of Exiles player, so there is going to be a lot of optimizations in the skill tree that could probably be much better, as well as gear as well. And the next disclaimer is I'm going to assume that there's going to be lots of shock / electrocute mercenaries based on a skill tree for this elemental damage to taxes, especially with all this lightning stuff too. But this is the version of the shock mercenary with Stormcaller Arrow and shock burst rounds. And my final disclaimer is going to be that I haven't fully tested this at proper endgame content. What I mean is I haven't even found a Citadel yet, so I don't know how it performs in this. I haven't done logbooks, I haven't done simulacrums, I haven't done even Bleach Realm Gates. So I can't really comment on how it performs in these as right now. All I can tell you is that it feels really nice just running through tier 15 maps, especially when we're going to be running maps like this with crazy modifiers and not really having too much of a problem, even with, especially when our Atlas does look like this with unstable energies, making our maps even more dangerous by giving it 25% more effect on prefixes or suffixes when we open up the map, and also giving our bosses plus 1 to 2 additional modifiers. And then we're also on plus 3 map boss difficulty as well. But we're still having not much of a problem run through rare tier 15 Waystones. But anyways, this is going to be it. Just want to say thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed the video, please leave a like, comment, or even consider subscribing. And I hope to keep looking for the next one. I'll see you next time.